The War of Aryan Independence was perhaps the most bizarre conflict in human history. It had such a profound impact, leading to the more than century-long Great Peace, but in its own time there was not much at all to say of it, save for a long list of deadly stalemates in the independence of Europe and Kai. Later historians would describe it as a stone thrown into a lake. The stone itself is not so important as the ripples which play across its surface. This war served as the greatest of humiliations on the part of Poyang and her empire, and so throughout the Great Peace she saw her star fall, now subordinate to her rivals. This engendered a certain bitterness, which was expressed in a shift of colonial policy, tightening the leash on all remaining colonial subjects, imposing taxes and revoking the colonists' rights to self-assembly, as had long been established in Pomo with their Zhejiang system of governorship. At the same time, investment was poured into the colonies in order to improve them instead of stretching aimlessly into the frontier. This approach spread to the other colonial nations of the world, and was soon adopted. Over the course of the Great Peace, Europe began to catch up to Asia, and by the end of the 18th century had very nearly matched them for technological prowess. This charge was led by Avarignia, which itself became a great power, one to rival Rome. Of course, the Industrial Revolution changed this, and put Europe firmly back at the starting line. When the steam engine was invented by Ming Taoming and Shaojin, the Great Peace was shattered to pieces. Suddenly, Asia found itself on top of the world again, and all the progress the West had made in regards to mastering the arts of sail and powder seemed now to have been some great waste of time. Sporadic wars of conflict engulfed the world again, with Namning subjugating Tongren, Gaizhou colonizing Siberia, Kaimur expanding to more than double its original size, and Pomo continuing its march across Peng Bay. Indeed, by 1836, the East boasted of factories which smelted iron and pounded out vast plates of metal, and bullets, and railroad tracks which sprawled across their rich countries. Innumerable textile mills which turned out reams of cheap and high-quality fabric, huge canneries which preserved food and kept it from spoil in a way that few thought was ever possible, and shipyards which even now experimented with riveting the sides of their great ships with metal. Great mines were opened which tore into the rich natural veins of coal which they discovered, which was itself powered by such bold new innovations. This is all not even to mention the scientific and political developments of the age, with scientists in Namning developing the controversial theory of evolution, while in Laizhou the idea of a state pension was debated in its royal courts. Representing the most populous countries in the world by a wide margin, the great empires of the East had to contend with literal millions flooding into the cities from the countryside, which presented its own benefits and challenges. And so the rest of the world found itself looking on once again, absolutely bewildered and by comparison rather inert. Kilwa suffered a great collapse, with dozens of tribes breaking away, ripe for colonization, while the Pacha Federation swelled in size. Zaratherma, meanwhile, was entering another period of stagnation as Kaimur proved itself now too difficult to raid given the new technological gap between them. With new cartographic techniques at their disposal, the University of Meizhou and Poyang produced the Chongfeng, translating to the Revisitation, and due to its sheer detail and complexity became the new standard around the world, replacing the Lurthekla. One of its major innovations was the introduction of latitude and longitude lines, making it especially useful for navigators. It also featured a revised list of the great powers, which was in descending order as follows: Shaojin, Laizhou, Namning, Poyang, Gaizhou, Phrygia, Rajasthan, Mongolistan, Rome, and Avarignia. For the purposes of this chronicle, the world shall be surveyed in a familiar fashion, beginning with that progenitor peninsula, Iberia. The overlord of that region, Avarignia, crouches low over its empire, which it guards jealously from any comers, its flag flying defiantly against Rome, especially in this age, beneath its monarch, Imperator Lope Indecitus de Roma. A presumptuous title for an upstart on the periphery of world power. Next, the Gallic region remains much unchanged from ages past, with Arvernia and Triballia continuing their age-old rivalry against one another, Triballia having kept with Avarignia while Arvernia had since returned to the side of Rome. Then, the Italic region, Germanic region, and Britannic region were still lorded over by the cruel Roman eagle, under their imperator Gilberto Caesaria of the Carnia Bonifilius. Rome had long since focused on themselves, improving the quality of their cities and the defensibility of their empire, which they viewed as having been cheated out of its birthright. As such, Rome had massed unimaginable wealth, and was even richer than many Eastern nations, even if they couldn't match them for technology. It is worth noting that, through the centuries, England and Gwynedd had been run absolutely ragged through their resistance of Roman rule, though supported by Norland and with new support from a long isolationist island, Iskland. Over these generations, a warrior culture of knightly honor developed, and as they starved and were repeatedly culled in their thousands by the great legions of Rome, they still maintained their existence against the great empire, winning heroic victories against them in the name of the Allfather. Northern Europe was dominated by the rivalry between Norland and Samogitia, cleaved along their attitudes towards Rome. Norland had since broken with Rome completely, while Samogitia embraced the wealth and status that such allegiance afforded them. Eastern Europe was defined by the network of alliances they built amongst themselves and the distinct cultures which populated them. They had all largely broken with Rome, Mongolistan, and Phrygia, preferring to ally with themselves or countries further afield. As such, Perugia and Serdia constituted one alliance, while Box and Artavicia constituted another, with Serdia reaching across the Mediterranean to ally with Avarignia as well. Still, these relations shifted all the time, and the region as a whole was characterized by paranoia. The Balkans were defined by the tension between Serdia and Phrygia, with Serdia becoming a culture steeped in hatred for Phrygians not only as Greeks, but also as pagans which lorded over the Holy Land, claimed by the Zosanal Church. As such, relations between them and Mongolistan were very close, and Phrygia was careful not to instigate a war with them, lest they be bisected at the Levant. The eastern Mediterranean was completely dominated by Phrygia and their imperator, Vakliklas Agathoclid. The maintenance of this dominance is something they made a major policy goal throughout the 19th century. Africa was characterized by Avarignia, Rome, and Phrygia dominating its northern flank, Toro lording over the west, the homegrown tribal confederacies of Tubu and Kilwa holding Central Africa against foreign influence, and Avarignia swiftly colonizing the southern coast. Overall, its main feature was the fractured myriad of primitive tribes which constituted much of the continent, animated by nothing more than survival and mostly ignorant of the newcomers slowly consuming their continent, as they had been for centuries at this point. Little did they know that this process would only accelerate in the coming years. The Middle East was now dominated by two major powers, Phrygia and Mongolistan, the latter under their current Khan, Kormisosh Argteni. Stretched across the sands of Mesopotamia was the world's longest actively militarized zone, with regular patrols and skirmishes, around 100 people dying at the border every year. On the ground, the Phrygian territory was now populated almost exclusively by Greeks, while on the Mongol side of the border, the original ethnic minorities had long since huddled together, like the Persians, Omanis, Yemenis, and Arabs. Of course, this fomented extreme ethnic strife in the region, and Mongol Persia became one of the most dangerous places in the world as a result, especially as it began to industrialize. Then we come to the east, the true nexus of power upon which the entire world turns. Beginning with the minor players, Urad stretched itself across the snowy north, getting in regular skirmishes with their fellow Mongols in Mongolistan over their religious differences, making the tundra one of the flashpoints of schismatic strife between the Yuzhou and Zosanal churches. In central China lay the losers of the great eastern wave of progression, with Mongquang, Tianshui, and Tongren all having been divvied up and added to their neighbors' sphere of influence. One noted beacon of resistance, however, was the island of Japan, under Shogun Joben Hayashi. After the invasion of Laizhou, the Hayashi shogunate deposed the emperor, and thus the Kanin dynasty, essentially turning Japan into a military dictatorship. Japanese spies have since dispersed across the continent and have been stealing technology from the strongest of their rivals, in the hopes of one day expelling Laizhou. Speaking of which, now the map comes to the great powers of Asia. Gaizhou, under Huangdi Bohengdu, was interested in expanding their influence overseas in order to escape the power of their southern neighbors. Laizhou, under Huangdi Deizhou, sought to increase their domestic power first and foremost, mainly by expanding west against Rajasthan and east against Japan. Shaojin, under Huangdi Chengzu Du, pursued industrialization at full speed, seeing in that process the keys to lording over not only all of China, but the whole world. Poyang, under Huangdi Bochengshi, sought to restore its former glory, and through the vast wealth of its colonial holdings, become the dominant power once again, undoing its great embarrassment. Nam Ning, under Huangdi Akbingzhuang, sought to play the role of foil in the region, throwing around their weight as a great power to prevent any one party from becoming too strong or too weak. Nam Ning supposed that it had no chance to become the dominant power outright, so by preserving the status quo it could ensure it would not fall from its current position, which it found rather comfortable. Finally, Rajasthan, under Maharani Rina Gorkha, sought to counter Nam Ning and displace them as master of Southeast Asia. Oceania was a region defined by brave new possibilities due to the young Republic Eora Fenkai asserting the region and even its native peoples as belonging to them to do with as they pleased. The Java Crescent was a line past which Eora demanded mainland Asian powers stay out. However, this was not a demand which Poyang was willing to respect, especially not concerning the colonies they already had in the region, which they put under the jurisdiction of the Pacific Gan Company, in order to maintain some semblance of deniability. As for the New World, it was filling up quick. Pengbei was still Poyang's backyard, though they were countered by colonial rivals in Shaojin and even Gaizhou, while Zaratherma represented an imminent ideological threat, considering they were a functional republic, much like Eora. The northeast was still populated by a great many native tribes, most of whom were members of the Pacha Federation or were subjects of the Huron. Finally, Pangnan was simply divided between the colonial powers of the age, with Nam Ning's Kaimor, Avarignia's Trinahinth and Arvrupes, Laizhou's Tarisha and Kalama, and even the direct administrations of Mongolistan and Gaizhou, not even bothering with the veil of colonialism. And so the stage was set for the rest of the 19th century. Zaratherma attempted to come out of its present slump by fostering positive relations with Shaojin in order to counter Poyang and its colonies, while also pursuing a domestic policy of bureaucratic construction, building local offices to which local guild members could have a direct line to the Preta and the representatives thereof, thus making the government more responsive to developments on the ground. In April of 1836, Poyang attempted to make a public appeal to Eora Fenkai and their own neighbors, seeking to add them to their empire yet again. As a result, Nam Ning enacted an embargo against Poyang, shutting them off from influence in Southeast Asia and Oceania. In February of 1837, Poyang responded to this with force, declaring a joint war against Nam Ning and the Eora Fenkai, making landfall in Eora scarcely a month later, blasting through Nam Ning's blockade. As a result, despite fierce resistance, Eora Fenkai was reintegrated as a colonial subject of Poyang in 1838. Later that same year, a devastating earthquake struck Zaratherma, leading to widespread devastation in the area. When the Preta announced it had but a pittance to provide for relief, the people began to clamor for radical changes, and some even a change of government. As a result, the current Mekhus, Cesario Acosta, declared war upon Nicosaté, which at the time only consisted of the West Indies. This symbolic struggle distracted them, and in January of 1839, General José Masson Elordi was given 4 regiments and directed to lay the islands low. And indeed he did, conquering them in their entirety by September before Avarignia could come to their aid. In November, the Bessemer process was discovered in Shaojin, allowing for the mass production of steel from pig iron. Meanwhile, back in Zaratherma, the elections of 1840 featured a rather peculiar innovation: political parties. Within the Preta, certain guild representatives had different motives and political aspirations. For example, the Merchant Guild desired lower tariffs and fewer restrictions on immigration in order to drive down wages, while the Farmers Guild advocated for protectionism, and the Shipwrights Guild just so happened to be populated by highly religious, highly nationalistic people. As a result, apart from these guilds, political parties began to form within and between them. As such, these parties competed for the 36 guild votes in order to determine who would be the Mekhus. This election saw the formation of and competition between the conservative, patriotic, and liberal parties, of which the Conservative Party won. The new head of state was Mekhus Imats Caritas, and his first order of business was to drastically increase the number of representatives per guild, such that political parties became the main driver of political action, all of them competing to win 36 guild votes. He supposed it would make politics more competitive and thus better serve the people, and the Preta agreed. And so the number of total representatives was tripled to a total of 108, competing for 36 guild votes, which would soon be definitionally changed to guild points. For example, if 2 members out of 3 in a given guild pledge their votes to a certain party, then that guild point goes to that party's preferred candidate. In February of 1841, acting in accordance with what he believed to be immutable Christian principles, Huangdi Chengzu Du declared a ban on slavery and announced that the navy of Shaojin would be patrolling the Pacific Ocean to raid and sink any slave ships they found, returning their human cargo to their continent of origin. Their number one enemy was Toro, which was declared to be anathema to the teachings of the Shugaoja. This earned him the nickname of Zio Dashi, or Master Freedom. This brought some pushback from Nam Ning and Lai Zhou, but Poyang was confident that it could keep the institution of slavery alive by way of its superior naval might and widespread colonial empire. In 1843, Shaojin allied with the Pacha Federation, bringing them into the global abolitionist coalition that the Ziyu Dashi was forming. This, in turn, soured its relations with Zaratherma, which depended on the slave trade. As such, Zaratherma pivoted to courting the good graces of Lai Zhou, since as things stood at the moment, Zaratherma persisted as being one of the most isolated countries in the world, just behind Toro. In 1844, Gaizhou was being invaded by Lai Zhou for the purposes of extracting valuable trade concessions, so Zaratherma saw its opportunity and invaded their colony of Lacandon. Unfortunately, Gaizhou was able to flex its might as a technologically advanced great power and handily defeated Zaratherma, extracting reparations from them equal to 10% their income for the next 10 years. In 1847, Shaojin began to enforce its new abolitionist policies on its native subjects, who themselves decided to rebel against Shaojin. This is because the natives of this region held a long tradition of enslaving their enemies, and to be robbed of that would amount to being robbed of a part of themselves. As such, the Nehia, Dakota, and Chiaja tribes rose up against Shaojin's colonies of Salish and Picani. In June of 1851, Phrygia fell into civil war, a huge contingent of new industrial workers rising up against the government in an attempt to glean greater rights for themselves. This was short-lived and put down in November, but the message stuck. People began to discuss the rights of the working man and developing class consciousness. It would take some while longer for these ideas to coalesce into what it would become, however. On December 19, 1854, the Ziyu Dashi died and his son, Huang Di Andu, threatened to renege on his father's progress towards abolition. The new class of industrial capitalists, which had come to make up much of the military, however, desired continued abolition, as it undercut their land-owning rivals in the aristocracy. And so a short but bloody coup removed the young lord from power, and Shaojin became a military dictatorship with General Wang Kui at the helm. This immediately alienated them from their imperial neighbors. Then, on January 1st, 1856, Shaojin invaded Poyang, betting their highly productive and specialized military could overcome the vast seafaring agrarian empire of Poyang, and force them to abolish slavery once and for all. Such a war was the largest and most significant since the War of Aryan Independence, and only time would tell how the world would react to such a conflict. Will this be localized to these Eastern Titans, or does the issue of slavery hold with it a fuse that could ignite the entire world?